Thank you very much. It was an amazing presentation. And you touched on so many parts of the world. You didn't, I mean, whether it's Asia or the Middle East or Europe and America. I was just curious, where does South America fit into this in your mind?
Well, I've shared with John before. It is my firm belief that by 2010, the financial axis of the world will exist if you start a dot in Cairo and you draw a line from that dot to Beijing and you do a 6-hour plane flight on either side of that line. It's bounded on the south by Singapore and Indonesia. It's bounded on the north by the natural gas reserves of Russia, and it's a corridor that goes there. Now, the reason why I say that is not just because I think it. The reason I say that is that's where the money is right now. That is where growth is happening, because you catch in that all of the majority of the Indian subcontinent, you catch in all of the Persian Gulf area, you catch a lot of the stands that nobody likes to pay any attention to, but oddly enough, a lot of those stands are doing quite well, thank you very much, and they're actually gaining significant treasuries, each one of them. That's where I see that axis. Now, the South America question is a very interesting one, and as you all know, the northern portion of South America right now is actually on an interesting field test. I'm not going to weigh in on Chavez and where he is or isn't, but I'd encourage you to read the history of our relationship with Castro and the history of our relationship with a few other places and see if there's any pointers there, but I'm not going to comment on it. But the interesting thing about South America is it's in the middle of a transition experiment today, and I believe quite regrettably for much of Meso and South America, not just South America. I think this is going to come north, and I think it may actually come all the way up to Mexico, and dare I say potentially into our own country in certain parts of the southern part of our country. We may find ourselves in a situation where the experiment in which they are now engaged doesn't have time to run its course. If you look at the infrastructure issues, if you look at the financial issues, if you look at where the infrastructure is going right now, telecommunications and power, particularly if you look at Chile, Argentina, and Brazil right now, you realize that they're in the midst of discussions on how they're going to re-engineer infrastructure. The first efforts that are being seriously undertaken in that area are in Chile, no question. They are miles ahead of much of the rest of South America. They are very advanced in looking at alternative energy. They're very advanced in looking at alternative water purification, extraction, distribution, telecommunications distribution, and so forth. And the problem that South America looks at as we look at a 2008 to 2010 horizon is actually a capital illiquidity problem at our end. Because if you look at who is selling into that market at the infrastructure level, you see an inordinate imbalance of U.S. and Japanese credit supporting those projects, which I believe may very well be an inversion of development cycle if 2008 to 2010 goes the way I think it probably will go. Now, I'm not bearish on the whole picture. I think that there are others who will step in to support it. But if you look at where the FID right now is coming from, all of that direct and indirect investment is coming predominantly from U.S. and from Japanese credit sources, who are likely going to be the ones with the greatest immediate term exposure. In the insurance market, remember after September 11, 2001, remember what happened to the insurance market. Great initiatives, and all of a sudden, September 12th, and every new initiative was off the table, and all we focused on was premiums that we could jack up in property casualty. All the other stuff went away. Why? Not because it wasn't good. It was because you could sell property casualty insurance for 3x the premium. So you didn't leave the market from the standpoint of it was no longer attractive. You went to a market where there's high degrees of liquidity. And I think South America could find itself in a very unattractive position in 2008 and 2009, because as you go through the ripple of capital adequacy testing, a lot of that credit currently is being provided from financial institutions which probably have the greatest exposure. The instinct is to say, Bank of China, Construction Bank, People's Bank. The problem with that instinct is twofold. One is U.S. equity ownership. Those banks have gone public, and they've gone public in our domestic and European domestic markets. That's not a good place to have your stock trading if you're trying to raise more money. Secondarily, China is going to have to figure out what it does with yuan when you actually wind up with a treasury that's a little squirrely, because the currency issues and everything else that's going to happen domestically. So I believe that where most of the time in kind of classic economic theory you'd see a Chinese presence stepping in a closed model system, I think that the codependency China has based on their current treasury exposure and based on what they've done with their banking system to privatize it and put it into tradable securities right now may actually disable their effort to step in, which leaves us with who that still has cash. Yes?
The analogy you gave of the situation poses some very clear geopolitical implications in respect of whether we could develop this relationship with potential partners in the Middle East. Can we do that if we continue to acquiesce in this sort of policy?
My grandfather is a very, very wise man, and I recall many dinner table conversations around his house in Silver Spring where he vigorously advised against stating things that could smatter on tipping your hand as to your political predilections, as it were. So I'm going to answer your question in a fair but agnostic way. I believe that where we stand today, we have a 0 probability chance of success if we try to reform those cultural incompatibilities by intervening in the current march of our foreign policy side. Left to the State Department, everything that I just described goes hell in a handbasket. But once again, in honor of my mother who says, don't ever only talk about the downside, there are very clear opportunities that we could look at. I think we're in a very interesting time with respect to WTO. And I think we're at a point where WTO's unraveling functionally is already on course. But I think in the absence of WTO, you're going to see emergence of small sequestered units of free trade agreements that go between potentially sovereign interests. But I think in excess of sovereign interests, you may find other non-governmental interests entering into strategic partnerships. And I think this is where public-private partnerships between both commercial interests and NGO interests may very well have a chance to build some of those interdependencies, which one day could be very valuable to us, at a pace that the public policy side cannot match. The challenge, therefore, would be to say, how could one build an interdependency where it becomes in the financial interest of parties to build alliances, where potentially the geopolitical alliance building ran out of time. Even if somebody started today and said, okay, from today on we're going to fix this, we get to January 2008 too fast. So I guess what I would encourage is to be creative about how we look at how the problem gets solved. I think that looking to the state to solve the problem doesn't happen fast enough. And I think it's a place where truly the only way we address your issue is to say that we'll fall on private sector interests to actually build cross-dependencies which will be strong enough and valuable enough to be those tenuous threads that hold us together when the natural predisposition is to fall apart. I would offer as an example a very bad example, and that is the pipeline that allegedly could go from Iran to India. Now, whether that gets built or not is an open question, but I use it as an analogy because it's a good one. The analogy is a good one because if you think about it, it kind of doesn't make sense at all. You're going to run a pipeline from Iran across, oh, that's right, Pakistan. You heard me right. You're running a pipeline from Iran across Pakistan into India. And you're hoping that what you put into the pipeline in Iran actually makes it to India. I just want to say whoever came up with that suggestion, I really respect. Because saying that in a room of any size, in anything other than the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles when you're alone, sounds like you're saying you're going to take a pipeline from Iran and run it across Pakistan to supply India? That's what it sounds like. But if you think about it, think about what happened after that deal was announced. Somehow or another, bus exchanges on the northern border of India and on the southeastern border of Pakistan started. And nobody here seemed to even pay attention to that. Bus exchanges, where people who had been separated, sometimes for generations, kids who hadn't seen their parents, grandchildren who had never seen their grandparents, actually went across that border on buses. Who did that? Who did that? Was that a giant State Department initiative?
No way.
Was that a giant, let's get New Delhi and let's get Islamabad and let's get them down to the table and let's make all of this happen that way? Or was it a few brave souls who said, you know what, you can move things across this border? And people got on buses owned by the Homeland Security Department. No. Got on buses that were parked in Louisiana, got on buses and actually went across the border. Now, how do I get from pipelines to buses to the answer to your question? And the answer is, I just did. The solution is to say, figure out a way where you can throw the first cord across the chasm and make that cord so desirable that people really want to protect it. And you know what those bus exchanges did? They became myth. I was in Ahmedabad when that first bus exchange happened. That's right, the city where Hindus and Muslims can never get along. That's the city of 10 million in Gujarat. Oh man, I just told you where it was. I told you I wasn't going to tell you, but now I told you. In India. But I was there. And do you realize that at the restaurant where I saw those bus exchanges on TV, half of the patrons were Hindus and half of the patrons were Muslims, and all of the patrons hugged one another when that bus exchange happened. That's the best I can do. I think that's what it takes. Because I can't fix what has too much momentum for me to fix. But doggone it, I can be creative and outwit it. Yes?
What does an Islamic